I'm Fred Blackwell. I'm the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, and I just wanted to start by saying welcome to the foundation. We are very excited to have you here and really excited to be hosting this conversation. And I am really just going to get right to it. We are excited about this for a variety of reasons, and I'm just going to name a few of them. The first is that many of you know that we now operate under an organizing framework or a North Star that is about racial and economic inclusion and equity. And that really colors everything that we do and cascades down throughout the organization. And obviously for us, that agenda is both about kind of the things that we need to do from a programmatic and advocacy point of view on a variety of issues. And one of those issues has to do with getting people on firmer financial ground. And a lot of times that conversation leads quickly to a conversation about income and doesn't always lead to a conversation about wealth. And so the second reason why I'm excited about this and why we're excited about it is because when you look at that conversation, it leads us to kind of economic opportunity and the lack thereof for many folks that we work with and care about. When we look at wealth, the disparities become even more stark. And so thinking about racial equity and economic inclusion in ways that both kind of touch on the income dimension, but then also touch on the wealth dimension and asset dimension is something that's really important. And frankly, there aren't many venues to have that conversation. So I think it's really exciting to be able to do this. Third is, Bob is a trustee on the San Francisco Foundation board, just in the spirit of full disclosure. And we're not just doing it because he's a pushy board member. We're doing it because it really fits in with the agenda that we're talking about. And if you've had a chance, and I hope you do all have a chance to read the book, Bob does a wonderful job of drawing out both very important and intimate stories around how this stuff really impacts people, but then also draws the line between that and the policy implications associated with the work that we are engaged in. Fourth is, it is fabulous to have Mayor Tubbs in the house. The claps probably suggest that you know already that he's one of the youngest, if not the youngest, mayor of a city over 100,000 people. But more important than that, he has been a trailblazer on a number of the things that we talk about and care about, and I think really put wind back in people's sails around the kind of people that can be in elected office and provide leadership at that level. And so it's really great to have you here. And then the last thing, not all of you all can see this, but Bob has green shoes on. The mayor has fabulous socks. So we're just really ready to go. Bob, I want to start with you. Why'd you decide to write this book? Like, why did you think it was important to get all this on paper right now?
Well, first, can I just say thank you for humoring this pushy board member. And I'm honored to be here with these two and with all of you. I really appreciate your coming. So, I believe that there are proven economically, socially, politically, practical solutions to what I think is one of the biggest anyway, economic problems we face, which is that most Americans and a supermajority of people of color and women lack the few $1,000s I think they need to be buffered from the everyday accidents and illnesses that otherwise reverberate into crises, to have the space to imagine a future better than the present, and then a reason to plan and prepare, and ultimately the ability to invest in yourself and your kids when only you believe. In Van Jones's word, I think we're leaving genius on the table. And so the three central messages of the book, one you mentioned, I do think wealth matters. and when there are discussions of poverty or there are discussions of inequality, it always devolves to income inequality or employment. But I think, the basalt, the basic structure of economic opportunity is wealth disparity. And for example, the fact that African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans own a few cents for every dollar white men own. And I think projected ahead, that affects income, that affects education, that affects health, and the like. The second is, I think we've proven, and when I say we, I mean Prosperity Now, the organization I founded and Andrea Levere leads, and our partners, like Opportunity Fund and so many others of you in the group, have proved that given a reasonable opportunity, which I think is often as little as a few $1,000s, low income, even very poor people will go to college, start businesses, create jobs, buy and keep homes, create futures for themselves, their families, their communities, and the country. I believe real economic development grows bottom up. And then the most important reason is we have a huge budget already in this country that could enable every person to have a few $1,000s a year in assets, in wealth, if only we used it well. So we're spending $700+ billion a year at the federal level, and probably Chris Haney will give us the actual number, but in excess of $20 billion at the state level in wealth building tax incentives, home mortgage interest deduction, preferential capital gains, pension fund exclusions, 529 college savings programs. The top 0.1%, the richest 0.1%, get an average annual benefit from those of $160,000 a year. Working families making $55,000 or less get an average annual benefit of $226. What's wrong with this picture? But that averages out to $2,200 at the federal level for every man, woman, child in the country. What could that do if we reapportioned it?
Sure. And Bob, just a couple of follow-up questions for the folks that are in the room and the millions of people that are watching via live stream. Tell us what's in the book.
So I struggled at these first ones to try and put 260 pages in a few minutes. So there's 6 chapters on wealth, savings, education, business, and home, and then finally prosperity. So the first chapter kind of lays out my personal story, and also says that wealth is too important to be left just for the wealthy, that everybody needs and deserves a nest egg. And again, most people don't have it. The next 4 chapters talk about the major routes toward building wealth. And each chapter kind of talks about conceptually, what are savings or what's the role of business. Turns out all net new jobs created in this country for the last 30 years were from new businesses. And what you need to start a new business is personal savings, savings of friends, family, associates. So I talk about the way that kind of works, and then the evidence from 40 years of pretty rigorous experimentation and 250 years of history in the US on those kind of programs. And then I offer solutions. And really, I wanted to focus on solutions. I'm so let down. So many of the books, you talk about the problems, and then you get to the final chapter, and then there's not much on what you do about it. I think we have a proven repertoire of community practice, public policy, private market interventions that we could scale. And then the last chapter tries to pull it all together, really talking about the 4 waves of investing in the common genius in our history: universal public education, the Homestead Acts, the creation of the 30-year mortgage by the federal government. 100 years ago, 10% of Americans owned their own homes. We created the market. We created the conditions that brought home ownership in the purview of the middle class. We can do it again. And then my favorite, the GI Bill. All of those had a downside. They left out women, people of color. But I think what was good about those policies can overcome what was bad about them.
So, one of the things that I love about the book are the variety of stories that you tell about people and their lived situations and how wealth or the lack of wealth enabled or held them back. Can you talk about maybe 2 of your favorite stories in the book?
Fred told me he was going to ask me this question, and I told him it was like choosing among my children. But I only have 2 children, and there are more stories. So most of the stories are people I regard as economic heroes who have started with not much and then moved forward. There are a couple folks who started out better off. I won't tell the story, but I do, in the first chapter, talk about Warren Hellman, who was a chair of the foundation board. And my favorite piece about that are the 2 quotes at the end, where he says, "I don't take myself very seriously. I know that a huge proportion of everything I've accomplished is luck." And then he said, "Money's a lot like manure. Hoard it in one spot, it stinks. Spread it out and good things grow." LC is one of my favorite people. She was born in the Desire Public Housing Project of New Orleans. I love how we name public housing. She says there probably were good things that happened in her first 9 years there, but she can't remember any. She never knew her dad. Her mom was an addict and in and out of prison. They escaped from New Orleans, an abusive non-spouse, and went to Denver, where and then she was taken away by the city authorities and spent time in 18 foster homes, none of them really home. She said she decided at age 9 that if she was going to do anything with her life, she was going to have to do it herself. She couldn't depend on others. She, about age 15, found an independent living program, and which, among other things, offered an individual development account, which is kind of the central tool I use in the book. Several of you have offered them to thousands of people in the Bay Area. My favorite description still of an individual development account, or IDA, is the welfare mom who said, "Oh, you mean 401k except for me." And here's the way LC described it. "I thought it was too good to be true at first. This was the first time in my life that people invested in me and my individual goals. It was a literal investment in cold, hard cash. I could save and watch it grow. I had had lots of programs, even some training in financial education, but this was the first time anyone put actual money that I could use for my future. If I saved, they would match my savings $2 to $1. I was in work study. I didn't earn much, but I put money into my account monthly, sometimes only a few pennies, most often $15 a month. I saved $1,500 over 2 years." She graduated from college debt-free. Today, she's a neonatal nanny earning a near 6-figure income, putting together the kind of families she never had. I think there are thousands, or actually, I think there are millions of LCs. Maybe I'll stop there.
I want to Mayor, get you into this conversation, but before doing so, I just want to point out that each of you either have in your lap or you're sitting on a question card. So I invite you to, if you have questions, fill that out and people will.
I thought those were contribution envelopes. I was trying to figure out for what.
We never miss an opportunity to ask people for money around here. Mayor, it's great to have you here. It's a long way from Stockton. What made you answer this invitation?
Well, a couple things, and they're all true. Some are funnier than others. The first thing is that I think, just given some of the geopolitical trends in California, with more and more Bay Area residents moving to Stockton, I think it would be prudent for the San Francisco Foundation to think about Stockton as part of their portfolio. Number two, I'm going to work with Bob to do some child savings accounts and some IDAs in Stockton, so I thought being here in person and talk about it would make that happen a little bit quicker. And then number three, more and probably most importantly, I think the conversation just around poverty, inequality, wealth discrepancies, income discrepancies, it's such a needed conversation. I think the work of you all in this room, but also this book, is able to kind of start a conversation that may be centered in the 2020 presidential election. And I think, especially mayor of the city of Stockton, where the median income is $46,000, where a third of my population is foreign-born, where we're trying things with universal scholarships for college and a basic income pilot, figuring out how do we give people opportunity, being part of conversations around sort of the social safety net of our community, but also just what type of society we want to live in. Like, what does it mean to be an American? What can we give people to kind of level or even the playing field, or at least provide a solid footing, is an important conversation for not just for my constituents, but for the country.
Thank you. And just want to invite both of you on this one. I mean, one of the things that was striking in the book is it kind of illuminated for me that the kinds of things that you're talking about, Bob, in the book in terms of changes to policy that incentivize a more equitable way to build wealth, it's not necessarily something new for this country in terms of providing those kind of incentives, although as you kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, there were some universal policies that didn't have equitable outcomes. So talk a little bit about kind of what's our history as a country around this, and what will it take to drum up the political will to do stuff like this?
So I think the last chapter, I take the historical perspective, and again, we've done a lot, and it is the big we here, to prove it in our own time, that we can do these kind of things. But I think I would answer your question by just talking a little bit about the GI Bill. So, basically we provided home loans, business loans, education, college loans to returning GIs. We financed 200,000 businesses, 5 million homeowners, 9 million college students. In 10 years, it democratized college education. It turned the income distribution from a pyramid to a diamond and tripled the middle class. But it did it largely for white men. It didn't do it for the 17 million women who were the arsenal of democracy. It didn't do it for African Americans in the South because the chair of the Veterans Committee, John Elliott Rankin, was an avowed racist, anti-Semite, believed in economic development for white men. He was a father also of the Tennessee Valley Authority, but he made sure that the administration of the GI Bill was left to state and local officials operating under Jim Crow in the South. In other parts of the country, it was more there. I do believe that what was bad about the GI Bill could be cured by what was good about it. And I think essentially what we need is a GI Bill for the 21st century for everyone, based on matched savings, designed to close the racial wealth divide in a generation.
And
Well, and can I say, and I think that our existing tax incentives are so skewed, so upside down, that we can make almost everybody better off. I actually think you make everybody better off by having a society with hope and mobility rather than despair.
And Mayor, I mean, you may not be a unicorn in this regard, but it feels like you are part of a small group of mayors that are pushing out things like universal basic income, universal progressive child accounts. What made you kind of put those kinds of things as a centerpiece of kind of what you wanted to do as mayor?
Well, I think first, part of it comes from just a deep personal experiences with things like poverty. It's not something I just studied at Stanford, but lived it. And it wasn't fun nor easy. And there's so many, and to your point you raised earlier, Bob, there's so much genius left on the table just because folks don't have their basic needs met. Or if they do have their basic needs met, they're not able to take on thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of debt and pursue higher education. And then number two, I think as a leader, the highest act of leadership is actually investing in people. That the city of Stockton is not a building, it's not City Hall, it's not our arena, it's not our Delta. It's really the people who live in the city. And if we're not investing in them and helping them as much as we can to make pro-social choices, then we'll continue to have the same narrative and the same conversations about kind of the issues and the ills plaguing the city. And then I also think just growing up in church, and for me, it just feels like it's part of what it means to be part of my faith tradition, that the righteous care about justice for the poor, that as you do unto the least of these, you do unto Jesus, he said. So for me, it's really, I just don't want Jesus mad at me, honestly. I just want to make sure, I'm doing right by him. So he needs housing, let's build housing. He needs some income, let's find a way to get him some income. He needs some SA, let's do that as well. But in all seriousness, I think I've also come to really appreciate that the majority of Americans are actually struggling. Even if they're not at the poverty line, they're one paycheck away, 2 paychecks away, or they're just mired in debt. And that's the experience of not a few, but like 1 in 2 can afford one $400 emergency. That's like a lot of people. And I think as a society, we can't claim to be great. We also are going to keep having a lot of the issues we have if we don't really get to sort of the economic system and figure out in what ways it needs to be restructured so that everyone can be productive and produce and create, because there's so much genius and entrepreneurs and folks who would be entrepreneurs, but they're trying to figure out how to pay rent next month. They would figure out how to make a new app, but they're trying to eat, right? So I think once we help people with those basic things, they can actually self-actualize and create the kind of society we want to live in.
And how's the city responding?
Yeah, I think we've been lucky in that the Patlets have been philanthropically funded in its first iteration, so that makes the conversation a little bit easier. But I think for the majority of people, even if ideologically they may not agree with some of the premises, I think they're excited that, number one, their pain is seen. I think oftentimes, especially folks like us who have nice jobs, wear nice suits, go to nice events, it's easy to forget, again, there's like a lot more people who aren't in suits, who aren't at nice events, who are literally struggling right now as we speak. And I think for them to have a mayor who speaks to that as not an act of God, as not of something that's all their fault, but as a partially or mostly caused by policy and structural forces, I think it's like, well, hey, I may disagree, but at least he sees that folks are working harder and harder and falling further and further behind. So what we try to do locally is center the conversation more on the problem we're trying to solve versus the solution. Because I think there's a lot of fights around the solution, but I'm like, that's fine. And there's probably not one solution anyway. It's a bunch of solutions. Like, I think the solutions mentioned here I really appreciate because they talk about wealth. Like, how do we help people build wealth when things like basic income really get to income? And those two things are both important, but they're different. So in Stockton, we talk about, well, the issue is poverty. Like, how do we solve poverty? And let's attack it in many ways. And this is one solution out of a bevy of solutions. So I think the response has been good. I don't get on Facebook anymore because my inbox has become a basic income application. process. And it's funny. It's funny in some respects, but it's also incredibly overwhelming. It's the amount of folks who are like, how something as small as $500 a month would mean a world of difference. Like there's one letter in my inbox that says that would allow me to sleep at night. Like there's things like that. And it's like, wow, we really have to figure out how to solve this problem. So again, I think the work you guys are doing at the foundation. Also, I thank you, Bob, for elevating this conversation. So we're not just focused on income, which is today immediate, but how do we build wealth, which is generational? How do we, once we say about folks' income, how do we make sure their kids aren't experiencing the same level of economic security, but there's actually something for them to build off? So appreciate it.
And Bob, you talked about the fact that you wanted you wanted the book to be couched in solutions. What would you characterize as the greatest hits in the book on the solution side?
Well, thank you. Basically, I don't like to be Johnny One Note, but I do think, and I think, there are a lot of pieces to solutions, but my bias is money matters. And so in each of the chapters of the book, I propose targeted scaled match savings accounts, universal basic savings, so that everybody has some stability money. And then I'll come back to the education, the child accounts, which I call generation accounts. And then business accounts, home accounts, and then prosperity accounts, which is kind of just a roll-up, and all with a sliding scale match, so that the poorest fifth of people would get, a 3-to-1, 4-to-1 match on their money, and everybody is included, but then it's lower down as you get to the top. Again, if I have to pick among my children, I maybe pick generation accounts, which basically, if we simply raised the estate tax to 2000 levels or 2005, and maybe eliminated the stepped-up basis for capital gains at death, which is maybe enough arcane that people won't get it, but it's a huge gift to people who are lucky and have, then you could finance generation accounts for everybody. We have evidence that poor kids with a college savings account in their own name are 3 times more likely to attend and 4 times more likely to finish, even with less than $500 in the account. It's not just about financial leverage, it's about psychological leverage. It basically, in generation accounts, I propose an endowment of $2,500 for the poorest fifth of kids each year till year 5, and then a 4-to-1 match for the first $500 in savings in those accounts each year. So you could get the poorest fifth of kids having $50,000 by age 18. And again, accounts across the scale. I think it would fundamentally not just change educational opportunity, but this is the best chance we have of closing the racial wealth divide in a generation.
And Mayor, when you read the book or you hear this list, were there things that jumped out to you like this is a home run for my community, or something that you felt like this is something that you could really run with?
Yeah, I don't like choosing between good things, so I want it all. I think folks deserve money for businesses and housing and education and all that, so I'm all in. I think the thing that would probably resonate the deepest in the community would be the childhood savings account, because I think that paired with our Stockton Scholarship is a really powerful message from students from the time they start school to the time they end. And there's really interesting opportunities to leverage and match, but also to the point raised earlier, we just changed the mentality of the community, whether it's the educators, whether it's the parents, or whether it's the students, that all our kids have the potential to be college and career ready. And we have money on the line. So they start kindergarten, and when they get to the high school graduation, there's another check for them. So there's real skin in the game. And I think that would do a lot to create a culture of expectation and kind of raise sort of what we expect from ourselves as a community. So we're going to be working on that.
There are two questions here about scale. One is about how do we identify which programs and policies are scalable? And the other one really about how we actually, once we identify what's scalable, how do we get there? How do we scale this up at a level that really matters?
Can I ask, you know the real answer. I'm going to give my back of the envelope answer. But I think we saw in the last tax cuts that were passed, financial distribution policies at scale. And I'm not sure there's much planning or thought behind it, right? So I think the issue is more one of like, what are we willing to do? Because the folks in power now are willing to do and figure out consequences later. How are you gonna pay for it? I don't know. It's gonna pay for itself. Like they just do voodoo math and it works out, and we fall for it every time, every 8 years, like way back. But anyway, so and I think Kamala Harris with her Lift America Act kind of gets toward that, and she was like, well, for the same amount we're paying for this tax cut, we could give cash to everyone making $100,000 a year or less. So I mean, I don't think the issue is how to get at scale. I think in the book he talks about most of those policy solutions you talk about aren't even new taxes. They're like changing or existing tax code, arcane things in the tax code to do this. So I think it's a question of how do we name this as a priority, and how do we demand from our elected officials to say, hey, this is a priority we care about. Let's figure out how do we pay for it.
I think that what he said, I would just point out, you know, we have actually 40 years of experience with different community practice models, with different state and local and federal policies, and with market adjustments. We actually know how to do this. And again, one of the nice things about money is we also know how to distribute. We also have a tax system that can work two ways, as we found with the Earned Income Tax Credit, right? And again, money, you have to do it right, but you can move it around, and you can plan it. And then we need, you know, financial institutions that will help. We give a huge subsidy to financial institutions in terms of federal deposit insurance. The very least they should do is serve both the savings and credit needs of their communities. You know, Michael Sheridan, who wrote Assets in the Poor, says that, you know, most of us are not good savers. We save in ways that are made easy for us. So 401k, you know, you come in, you get your job, you sign once to say, take 3% out of my pay. The employer matches it, the government gives some generous things, and then, you know, a few years down the road, you see that it's mounted up and you say, oh, I did that myself. You know, but we can make it easy. We know how to do this. I think it is, as Senator Booker ends his afterword of the book, it's a question of will. And it's a question, I think, of all of us demanding that average of $2,200 for every man, woman, child we're already spending.
So there's a question here about how this interacts with elders, folks who have worked for years, been pushing a rock uphill, going up against all the things that you've described in terms of policies that get implemented disproportionately in favor of some folks and not others, many of whom have already retired and are now recognizing that they don't have enough. Is there the question is kind of, what about us? How does this fit with that agenda?
A couple points on that. I considered putting a chapter of retirement in the book, and then decided not to, just because it was long enough anyway, and I wasn't fully conscious of it. We need a better system for retirement security. And, you know, California, Illinois, a few other states have done secured choice programs where we open up 401ks to everybody, you know, and require that business offer them, not necessarily that that they match. I think there should be matches, and again, we have the incentives to do it. We need to start early and enable people, make it easy for people to save now and build up a nest egg. I think the other thing is all of these assets are to some extent fungible, right? You build up home equity, which is the largest source of wealth. It can finance, business capital, or again, education. You earn more, you can put more away.
Mayor Tubbs, this one is for you, and I'm just going to read it verbatim here. It says, "You're doing so many important things. Are you meeting and talking with other mayors about spreading these good ideas to other cities, and are there venues for that?"
That's all mayors do. At least that's what my wife said. She said, all you mayors do is get together and talk about being mayor. And I think that there's some truth to that. So in June, I was one of the lunch plenary speakers at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. They wanted me just to talk about basic income for 10 minutes to all the mayors, so did that. National League of Cities last weekend was on the panel, 2 panels about economic security and basic income. Bloomberg has this institute with Harvard, which gets 40 mayors together from across the nation. We're going to a year-long kind of mayor's course thing together. And so we talk about it a lot. And it's been fascinating to learn sort of what other mayors are doing. We were just at Prosperity Now Summit with myself, Mayor Schaaf, Mayor Carter from St. Paul, and Mayor Woodridge from Tacoma, Washington. Talk about the different things we're doing, from childhood savings accounts to Oakland Promise, Stockton Scholars, basic income. So we spend a lot of time talking and sharing ideas and best practices and figuring out, okay, how do we actually move something that makes a difference for our folks? So absolutely.
Cool. So we're going to get a few more. While we do that, I'll take a little bit of moderator's license here. Mayor Tubbs, you talked about the fact that the UBI work and the Universal Progressive Child Account has been a little bit easier to push out because you have philanthropic support for it. What is the role of public-private partnership and philanthropic partnership in advancing these kinds of things?
Well, I think at its best, philanthropy gives folks the space to try things that aren't crazy because they're not good and won't work, but crazy because they may go against deeply held norms around what we think about when we think of work and worth and people, etc. So absolutely, I think it allows government to be a little more nimble and to be more bold. And we know the status quo is untenable. So let's try some things to make it better and learn from them. And then once we've learned enough, then we can take them to scale and put public dollars behind it. So I think, at least for the stuff we're doing in Stockton, whether it's our violence reduction work with Advanced Peace and Ceasefire, or the Stockton Scholars Program, or the Universal Basic Income Demonstration, all of it has been public-private partnerships to kind of give us the space in the room to be bold and to try something that may go against deeply held norms or biases around how how we would wish the world did operate, or how it should operate versus how it actually does. And I'm excited to see kind of the results, and can really take them to scale.
Bob, question here around race. Many of the things that we're talking about kind of have a focus on low income or poverty. Are there aspects of this that need to have an explicit race focus?
It's a great question, and I think there are huge racial disparities, right? And I also have some pictures in the book, but and one of them is the stratification by race and wealth, and it's huge. Tom Shapiro and Melvin Oliver talked about racial wealth divide as the sedimentation of past discrimination. I mean, this has been hundreds of years in the making. I think, I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. I think he made the case. It was interesting that at the end, his recommendation is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think we need much more than that, but we do at least need to know our own history. And we can't change that history, but we can change the trajectory of the future. And I think we need to do that with a racial consciousness. But you can do a lot. Income is a proxy for assets. It's not a perfect proxy. But I think we can move forward on that basis. And I do think we offer opportunity for all. Again, because the incentives today are so skewed. We can literally make 95, 96, 97, 99% of people tangibly better off than the current system. And I would argue even for the 1%, they get a civilized society.
And Mayor Tubbs, a couple questions for you. They're kind of related. The first is, who do you consider your allies among the mayors in advancing this kind of agenda?
Who asked that question first?
There's probably some mayor that's in the room is looking for some. And then the second part of it is like, now that you stepped out there with this kind of agenda, like, where do you look to for inspiration?
I'll start with the second question first. Well, and Bob talked about this earlier, but at every point of this nation's history, there was like a time of crisis or dysfunction. There's been some sort of movement, some group of folks that have got us the social contract that we have today. That's not perfect, but it's better than it was 20 years ago, for example. So that's super inspiring because I think convergence of forces from the, if not the increase, a more virulent version of white supremacy than we've seen in the last decade. The increasing wealth and income inequality, all the stuff happening with the climate. Like, I think it's a day of reckoning where we have the chance to be that generation where 50 years from now, they say, wow, they figured it. Wow, I can't believe this, like poverty was a thing. But that's so primitive, but they figured it out, right? So that I draw a lot of inspiration from that. And then from just like the amount of ordinary people that have really pushed this country to be its best self and live to its best values. Usually folks from like extremely marginalized folks, and that's like really inspiring. So like, I'm a mayor, I have a lot more agency than Harriet Tubman, who was Black woman slave in the 19th century, right? And so that's inspiring. And to the first question, I think the question was like, what mayors I like? Was that the question?
It was who your allies. And allies and like aren't necessarily the same.
No, I think I like to tell the truth. So I think all mayors we're allies on this idea that we want our cities to be the best that they possibly can be. So I spend a lot of time in conversations, on panels, and speaking and looking at sort of what mayors are doing in their cities throughout the state and nation. In terms of the mayors I talk to most frequently, I talk to Mayor Steinberg a lot in Sacramento, just because he understands like how the state capitol works and things of that sort. I talk a lot to Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, who's a good friend. Mayor Stoney in Richmond, Virginia. Mayor Benjamin, the U.S. Conference of Mayors president. I look to see who donates to Mayor Schaaf's initiatives, and I call them right after. So Mayor, lead the way, Mayor Schaaf. I'm right there. I think Mayor LaCarge, like it's a whole bunch. Mayor Breed. There's a whole bunch of mayors that I look to. Because I think every city that we're facing very similar challenges, and it's very inspiring to see, not all things, but in some ways how people are moving. It's okay, let's take that and do that here.
Mm-hmm. And related question, kind of, Bob, like, how do you feel about these various promise initiatives that are happening all over the nation? Like, how do you view that in relationship to this?
Well, I think it's part of a national movement. Martha Cantor, who now leads the association, I think she gave me different numbers, but 100 or 400 cities and counties that are doing this. I do think, and there's a marriage coming together of the college promise, which is, that everyone will go to college with a scholarship, but then also child accounts. Andrea and I were talking to the president, Michael Lomax, the head of the United Negro College Fund, and he said, we're operating the biggest scholarship program next to the federal government, but we're getting to kids too late, right? By age 18, you're either going or not going, and we're getting to them $5,000 to $7,000 short. That's why I think we need child accounts and the promise, and it's being integrated in wonderful ways, especially across the Bay. I think the Oakland promise, that every Oakland kid will graduate with the skills, resources, and expectations for success in college and career. And then they've knit together dual generation accounts and Head Start programs with kindergarten for college, with a scholarship program, but then also future centers in the schools and mentors, again, through college and one-to-one, and 1,000 community organizations and endorsers. There's a whole structure there that, for which accounts are the backbone, but there's much more to it. They're changing a culture, and I think that's possible.
And Mayor, you kind of joked that your Facebook account turned into a portal for UBI applications. Do you find yourself having to manage expectations around this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's a pilot. So it's at minimum it's going to be 100 families in February. We're in the middle of a raise now, so we may be able to help more, but that's not a guarantee yet. So it's tough because there's going to be 100 families that are going to get stabilizing force. They're going to do amazing things and make the city really proud. But there's going to be 300,000 other families that are like, what about me? But I tell people all the time, best case scenario is this goes so well that 300,000 people storm the city council meeting and say, hey, mayor, hey, council, we want this too. Like, how do we do this together? Because then it creates the avenue to have the conversation about, okay, where are our priorities? Where's revenue? We need to raise more revenue. Like, what can we do with the resources we have? But I think it also goes to the heart of why I'm here today, that cities can pilot things, but for things, it has to be national or state at least for really things to go to scale. So we're happy to test and pilot and learn and lead, but all in an attempt to get kind of state and federal actors to understand that this is sort of more so in their purview, and they more so have the tools with the tax code and other ways to make this happen for folks. So spend a lot of time managing expectations and letting people know the likelihood. You're more likely to not get it than get it.
And we're kind of starting to wrap up now, so just maybe any closing comments or remarks that any of you all want to share that didn't come out in the questions?
No, I just, Margaret Mead said, one person can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. I mean, this is an incredible group here. I think we need to turn the conversation to the possibility that everybody really could and should have an opportunity to play, to bring their dreams and skills and talents and work to the marketplace to build a future for their families and with them the communities and the country. This is not a zero-sum game. It's really wealth creation. But I don't think we're serving ourselves well by locking most families out of that.
And I'll just say two things quickly. The first is that literally not that long ago, like in the 1930s during the Great Depression, FDR came out with this New Deal. And all those programs we hold so sacrosanct today were like crazy back then, and it was done. The GI Bill after the war, or the Marshall Plan after the war, or even 50 years ago when you had Dr. King talking about a guaranteed income, you had Milton Friedman, Richard Nixon, you had Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld running basic income pilots those socialists, right? Like, and that was just 50 years ago. So what we're talking about, it seems like new and it seems like so big, but literally 50 years ago, these were the conversations that were routinely happening, not just in foundations, but in the halls of Congress, in city halls and city, et cetera. So I think I'm most excited about the opportunity to kind of get back to what we hold true as Americans, like American values of like opportunity. We want all our folks to have the opportunity to make choices. And then we got the conversation about choices people make. And I think I'm having a conversation about kind of the how central in our current economy money is to that is a needed one. And the last thing I would say is 8 years ago, I was able to go on the freedom rides with some of the original freedom riders. And we went through a bunch of places. But I remember one conversation that kind of gets to your earlier question about like why. This guy's name is Bob Singleton. He's a professor now at LMU. He was a 21-year-old UCLA junior and ACP president when he got on the bus to desegregate the country. And he said, I didn't know what I was going to do with work. I just knew I had to do something because the status quo was so untenable. I just hoping things would change without my effort, it just didn't sit well with me. And then he said he was arrested on August 4th, 1961. And he looked at me and said, now, why is that day important? And I looked and I said, well, because you were arrested. If you weren't arrested, we wouldn't be on this bus. And then he looked at me and he said, no, on that day, Barack Obama was born. It gets him every time. And then he said he had no idea that the choice he made on that day, which 50 years later paved the way for a child born with no opportunity to have the chance to become president. And then he said, what are you prepared to do today so that 50 years from now, a child in your community has more opportunity than you had? And I think that's the question behind this conversation, behind the amount of hours and research you did to write this book is really what are we prepared to do today, tomorrow, in 2020, so that 50 years from now we're having a different conversation in this country and not one rooted in continuing to talk about things that we know have persisted since the beginning of this country, mainly inequality based on wealth and income, further exacerbated by race. And I think it's responsibility not just of you, but of all of us to be part of that solution and to push and to read and to disagree, but to keep the centrality of our focus on the question, like what can we do to allow people to make their basic needs, create wealth, and end poverty. And I think if we start there, then 50 years from now, the folks looking back will be very proud of us, and the work we've done would have been worth it. So thank you.
Thank you. So for those, yes. For those who are streaming, the book is called A Few $1,000 by Robert Friedman. For those in the room, the Green Arcade is around the corner. They will be selling books, and I think Bob will be signing. Thank you, Mayor Tubbs. Thank you, Bob, for your leadership. Thank you all for being here.